All right, let's talk about a story most of us think we know inside and out. Noah's Ark. You know, the huge flood, the animals two by two, and that beautiful rainbow promise at the end. But what if that promise, that covenant, wasn't actually meant for everyone? Today, we're digging into a really wild theory that flips the whole story on its head. It argues this isn't about God's grace for all of humanity, but a specific charter for who actually gets to rule the world. Okay, let's jump right in. For centuries, this one verse has been seen as the foundational text for all human government. The standard interpretation is pretty straightforward. God is giving humanity, all of us, believers and unbelievers alike, the authority to create justice and govern themselves. It's this idea of common grace, where God provides a stable world for everyone to live in. But the author we're looking at today throws a huge wrench in that. They basically ask, hold on a second, what if we fundamentally misunderstood who God was talking to? The whole argument is that we've been misidentifying the audience right from the get-go. Now, just so we're all on the same page, the mainstream traditional view is crystal clear. This covenant, the one with the rainbow, was for every single person on planet Earth. It's seen as this universal promise that God will sustain human life, period. It doesn't matter who you are or what you believe. And this is where things get really, really different. Just look at this breakdown. The common view says it's a covenant for everyone. The author's view? Nope, it's just for the church. Establishes government for all? This new view says it grants rule only to believers. And that last point is a shocker. The benefits only apply to believers and their slaves. It's a total 180 from the traditional understanding, and we're about to see how the author even gets there. So, how in the world do you build a case like this? Well, it all starts by rewinding the tape and asking a very simple, almost obvious question. When God spoke these words in Genesis 9, who was actually there? Who was standing on the wet ground, fresh off the ark, listening? The author's entire argument, the whole massive theory, hinges on this one single number, 8. At that exact moment, there were only 8 human beings alive on the face of the earth. Noah and his wife, their 3 sons, and their wives. That's it. And this is the absolute linchpin of the argument. The audience wasn't humanity in general in some abstract sense. It was a very specific, named group of 8 people. And crucially, at that moment, they were all considered faithful members of God's covenant family. So in this view, they were the church. They were the whole shebang. So based on this very specific context, the author introduces a new term, covenant man. The idea is that when God uses the word man in Genesis 9, he doesn't mean all mankind. He's specifically talking about these redeemed, faithful individuals who survived the flood, the covenant keepers. Now watch what happens when you substitute that term back into our key verse. The meaning just completely transforms. It's no longer a universal grant of government to all people. Instead, the author argues it's God giving the authority to rule and to execute justice exclusively to the community of the faithful, to the church alone. Okay, and this is where the theory takes its most controversial and, frankly, shocking turn. If you follow this logic to its conclusion, the author says that from this specific redemptive point of view, people outside the covenant, unbelievers, are biblically categorized in a startling way, not as fellow rulers, but as beasts and slaves. So to make sense of this, the author introduces a framework. They say you have to think with 2 different biblical lenses. There's the creational lens, where, yes, all people are human and made in God's image in a general way. But then there's the redemptive lens, which the author says is the one being used in Genesis 9, where only faithful covenant keepers truly bear that image and hold its authority. And for proof, the author says you don't even have to leave the chapter. Right after the covenant is made, Noah's son Ham sins. What happens? His descendant, Canaan, is immediately cursed to be a slave of slaves. The author sees this as a live demonstration of the principle. The moment someone becomes unfaithful, they lose their right to rule. So the big picture argument here is that the flood was way more than just a punishment. It was a fundamental reset of global power. Before the flood, you had the wicked, like Cain, building cities and holding dominion. But after the flood, this author argues, that right was completely revoked and handed over exclusively to the faithful. And this, of course, leads to a massive, pretty startling question. If this theory is right, and unbelievers don't actually have the God-given authority to run things, then what are we looking at in the world today? Who is really in charge? And here it is. This is the author's most mind-bending claim. They argue that the true reality is that the world leaders and governments you see are just puppets, and the church, whether it knows it or not, is the secret puppet master pulling all the strings. So how does that even work? Well, the author lays out a kind of spiritual chain of command. It's a domino effect. First, the church is either faithful or unfaithful. Second, God responds with either pleasure or displeasure. And third, God directly translates that response into the success or failure of civil rulers, blessing them or cursing them as a direct result of the church's behavior. The takeaway from this is, well, it's staggering. It means that if a nation has bad government, if a country is falling apart, the ultimate blame doesn't lie with the presidents or prime ministers. In this view, bad government is just a mirror, reflecting an unfaithful church that isn't doing its job as the world's secret ruler. So, what's the solution? How does the church wield this immense power? Well, the author argues it has nothing to do with political rallies or voting blocs. Nope. The way the church changes the world is by pleasing God. And it does that by getting back to these 6 very basic internal spiritual disciplines. The idea is that real, global, geopolitical change starts right there, in the local church. And that leaves us with one final, very heavy thought to chew on. Whether you agree with this radical reinterpretation or you think it's completely out there, it forces you to ask a tough question. If it's true, even a little bit, that the state of the world is just a reflection of the health of the church, what do you see in that reflection today?